Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Natural Female Muscle Podcast, where today for episode number 41, we are going to talk about why your diet is actually legitimately so difficult. So in the last episode, which if you haven't watched that yet, I'd maybe suggest giving it a watch. You don't need to watch them both. But in the last episode, we did kind of run through all the things that are maybe making your diet feel so difficult. So not necessarily reasonings why it's so hard, but when it actually comes to the way that it feels for you, your own perception of the diet and how you can ultimately make, a general diet phase feel much easier, or reasons why you're maybe making it feel more difficult than it actually needs to be. Whereas today, we're actually going to go through reasons as to why your diet is actually so hard and possibly why it's harder than it needs to be. So we'll go through sort of reasons that can obviously affect this, but more so how we can actually manage and set up a diet in order for it to be productive, but have as little adverse effects as possible. Because let's be honest, a diet obviously has you can say they're negative effects. It has side effects. It does have side effects. A deficit is a stressor. So you will experience fatigue, you will experience increased stress as a whole. Obviously, that's just why stress management is even more so important. And you will just simply feel, you'll feel leaner and you'll feel the effects of that. So there are legitimate side effects that come along with the diet, but there are things that can make diets a lot harder than they need to be as a result of the setup. So we're going to go through really just a few different reasons basically things to consider when maybe either setting up a diet phase, so you're doing it yourself, or from a coaching standpoint, if you're setting things up for clients, or you're coaching yourself, whatever situation it may be, these are things you can think about if you're trying to understand why this diet is so difficult, or things that you can consider before you set up that phase to make sure that you don't encounter more difficulty than is absolutely necessary. And before we dive into the reasons, there are, of course, some things that can mean dieting is maybe not going as planned or as it should do when you enter a deficit. And some of these are obviously more underlying, potentially medical issues or physiological issues that need addressing. For example, if you've got hypothyroidism, or you've got Hashimoto's, or you've got, something that means that, you're not having the response that you need. And that's something that obviously needs to be addressed with a medical professional so that you can actually, make the adjustments there that you need to. So I'm talking in more so a wider sense of, your body is ultimately functioning well. It should be responding to a diet well. You're in a good place. You've not got any underlying medical issues, and you're kind of ready to go into a diet phase. So again, before I get into this, I did also just want to say a really quick thank you to the support in the last episode, and also to the people who have rated the podcast. So thank you, because I know I said in the last episode that I've got the goal of getting to 100 ratings, and I think I got 10 more from last episode, which is so cool. Special shout out to Nick for actually sharing it on a story. Absolute legend. But yeah, thank you so much for that. If you've not yet rated the podcast, if you can do, please, I would absolutely love that. But yeah, without further ado, we'll get into point number one. So this is actually probably the most commonly discussed topic that people talk about before going into a diet. And that is just simply, okay, what's your start point? What is your start point for that diet? What have, the past 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever it may be, have been before you've actually started the diet? Have you been in a gaining phase? Have you been in a maintenance phase? You ideally want to be in a position before you're dieting where the best case scenario, you've been running a phase of growing, or at least been in some form of, a slight surplus. And then you've been in a phase of maintaining, or at least just simply having been in a maintenance phase. The position you don't really want to be in is the position where you've not had much consistency. You've been in and out of a deficit. And this is often the situation that a lot of people, especially Gen Pop, find themselves in, is they've maybe been kind of in this binge restrict diet, or over overeating cycle where they kind of go deficit, surplus, deficit, surplus, and there's no maintenance there. There's no like just nice homeostasis that like the body's been like sitting in, and that's a problem, you know, because then they maybe reach out and like, I'm ready to diet, and it's like, okay, we actually need to just set a baseline. And this is something that I do with often with a lot of clients. If they maybe come to me and I feel as though like, well, they say, you know, I want to do a diet, and it's like, okay, we need to actually just set a baseline maintenance phase for a little bit of time, you know, get your body like feeling good with all the variables that it's got going, make sure that we've actually got like a good structure of food that we can then kind of respond to, make sure that training's feeling good. You want to have as much of a just like level baseline as you possibly can do before you go into that diet phase. So this is also why, you know, before you start a prep or before you start any diet, if you've been in like off season and you've been gaining, actually spending 2 to 4 weeks of just maintaining is a really, really good place to be. Because that then means when you make those adjustments straight out of the gate, you're going to have a response to them because you have been holding at legitimate maintenance. So you can make a 500 calorie drop from there and you're going to be in a 500 calorie deficit, rather than being in a position where you've been in a 500 calorie surplus. And then what you often see is people make a 500 calorie drop and then they're like, oh, I'm now just at maintenance. It's like, yeah, because you've not actually created a deficit. Not to mention the fact that you're going from two ultimately like stressful situations. You know, you're going from being in maybe an aggressive or a big surplus to pushing yourself down into a diet. Your body is trying to adapt to a lot of different things going on there, as opposed to actually just having a very, very level baseline and then being responsive to the changes. And especially if you have somebody who is very stress responsive, it's going to be really good to actually have a nice maintenance phase before you do go into that deficit in itself. Not to mention the fact that you can just make sure that all variables, like I mentioned, are in a great spot to pull from. So obviously there is food, but there is also, you know, making sure that training is in a spot where we're like, oh, okay, like when we're at this maintenance level, we can recover from this training. There's also expenditure, you know, making sure that steps are not catastrophic and maybe just spending a bit of time trying to bring those down a little bit, or making sure that CV, like all of these things are in a good place. Routine aspects we obviously discussed last week, but when you're looking like purely like coaching standpoint, where do we need to be? If you can create a baseline before you go into that diet phase and you can ensure like, okay, we've actually got food in a good spot, all of these variables, amazing. And that's why obviously spending some time prior to going into a diet, actually building up your food, improving training performance, improving your variables across the board, it's also going to be helpful, because otherwise you've got nothing to pull from, which we'll come on to later. And then being super picky, if you can also start a diet in your follicular phase, you will also then see a good response out of the gates. So this is also something, and these are all things to just make sure that initial couple of weeks, at least that initial week into a diet, should be really productive. And that will, for most people, be the most kind of productive week in the diet, where you often see, you know, good anywhere from like 5 pounds can come off in that first week, especially if you have been pushing for a long time, because you will see a huge drop off from like the food volume, just general inflammation coming down, and just honestly, like if you're sitting quite heavy, that initial bit of body weight that your body probably isn't enjoying holding, it'll come off like nothing. And you want to make those decent adjustments straight out of the gates. And this is another thing that's going to prevent the diet feeling so difficult later on, is when you are ultimately carrying more body fat, when you are feeling fresh mentally and physically, you know, you've not got any fatigue accumulated until this point. You are probably not that hungry at all because you've not been in a deficit yet. You're generally like feeling good. You're mentally fresh. You're excited. This is where you can push a little bit harder out of the gates, be a bit more aggressive, rather than, and this is definitely very applicable in a prep setting, getting to the final stages of prep and pushing like hell. You know, that's when the diet can then also get very difficult. But this is very, very, very timeline and individual specific. And I'm actually going to talk about this in next week's episode, where we go through pre-prep diets, because the amount in which you push out the gates is going to be very dependent on the individual and also very dependent on what phase it is. Like, for example, in a quick mini cutting off season, you can probably push quite aggressively. In a prep, for some people, you might push quite aggressively. However, for some other people, they might not respond very well to being pushed very hard, and they might also really struggle from an adherence standpoint. So actually continually keeping a moderate rate of loss, and then also maybe even for some individuals having it like quite moderate and then maybe having it a little bit faster in the latter stages, obviously not to the points where it's so excessive, can be helpful for them if it at least helps them to adhere because they see the end in sight. Is it the best way of doing it? Maybe not, but you have to take into context like that individual. Like, you can't just ignore that. So these are all things that then when you're mapping out the phase are important. So to round that up, like I've just said, the first things are then, what is the setting before going into that phase of dieting, and how are you mapping out that initial phase? And then when you're actually looking at, this is the second point now, when you look at the start point that you've had, so you're looking at, okay, this is where we're at, we've been maintenance, we've been off season, and you're going, right, we've had all this time to be gaining and we've had all this time to maintaining. What was the actual level of adherence like for yourself or for the individual that you're considering? Because you need to make sure that in those phases you are being very adherent. And this goes with both expenditure and nutrition, because this is really essential for the response. And this is where sometimes issues can come in, I suppose, a number of different ways. Because if you are, let's say, overeating or saying that you're doing too many steps when you're actually not doing that many at all, your coach might make quite a substantial reduction out the gates. Sorry, get my words right. They might put you into quite an aggressive deficit because they're thinking like, okay, they're at this level, let's push them. When really you've actually been eating more than that and doing less. And what you might find is that, one, in yourself, you kind of struggle to do that because you're like, crap, this is quite a big change from what I've been doing. And then you also might see a massive rate of loss, like really big jump out the gates, which is not a huge problem, but it might be unnecessary. So this is where there's two things. There's like, one, actually just making sure that you're probably being adherent where you can do, because even if you're like, let's say, overeating, you could have probably been eating, more quality baseline foods before that if you were doing those things. And ultimately it's where, like, just be honest with your coach. Like, if you're not adhering before you go into a prep, or you're not doing everything you need to do, please tell them, because they would rather know. Like, if you're overeating your diet, whatever it is, make sure they're aware. And this is where the same thing then goes for undereating, because this is probably actually more often a problem, is when, if you are under eating or you are overexpending, you're then really not going to be very responsive to the changes that are made, because your coach is assuming that you're eating, let's say, 2,500 calories, and you're actually eating 2,000 calories. They make a reduction down to 1,800, and you should be in a big deficit. And really, the deficit is not that much at all. And then you're not seeing much movement on the scales. So this is where, like, being honest with that is important, so that, one, your coach can either make the right changes, or two, they can actually appreciate, like, this is maybe not the time to diet. Because if you're actually not following this intake of food and you're actually overexpending like this, and you're already at this baseline where we ain't got much to pull from, it's not going to be a smart thing to do. So be honest with your coach in those settings, because it's only for your benefit. Like I say, these are all things that are to make sure that the diet is timed correctly and that it's not going to be crazy, crazy difficult for you. So those are a couple of things there. These all kind of tie into your actual body composition as well, I suppose, because your start point for the diet with regards to where your physique and where your body is actually at also play a role. So if you are very lean when you start a diet, you're already relatively lean, you're maybe going to have little to work with. And this can sometimes be a problem when you look at, like, doing excessive pre-prep diets, or also maybe going from like diet phase to diet phase, and like doing a photo shoot prep and then going, oh, I'm ready to go and prep. Because if you are in such a lean state already, or you've not had such a long time to actually come away from that diet, you're going to be carrying so much diet fatigue and so much stress from the previous diets and previous states that you've been in. And it's often why when you see people do like back-to-back preps, the second prep is often like really hard work because their body is just absolutely fucked. And that's where like having somebody who will be honest with you and say like, look, this is not a smart idea for you to do this, or it's not the right time, because it's going to be really, really difficult and you're probably going to start to see a lot of very adverse effects during this phase. So not starting from a position where you're like too lean, or you've maybe just got a huge amount of diet fatigue already and you've not been able to drop that off, you're not going to be in a good kind of responsive spot to begin a good diet phase, and you're maybe going to have to push a lot harder than is or should be really necessary. And then also starting ultimately too soft, again, this is where then you're probably going to encounter a diet where the rate of loss is going to be crazy, especially if it's a prep scenario. You definitely don't want to be starting a prep where you are a huge amount away from stage weight. And I know I've said, again, I'm going to talk about this in a pre-prep episode next week, but planning management will be very important, and maybe taking more time to prep, maybe making sure that if you are even, let's say, for example, you are working with Gen Pop, or you're working with someone who's not looking to get on stage, but they do need to come down a bit, mapping those diet phases out so that it's not one massive diet phase, and probably implementing diet breaks or doing it in chunks is going to be a lot more helpful. And this is just the whole thing is be mindful of whether you're dieting in the wrong time or in the wrong circumstances, or approaching it in the wrong way, because these will all be things that then contribute to that diet being more aggressive, more unenjoyable, and ultimately accumulating more fatigue, more issues, more problems, more physiological issues, most likely. So this now brings us on to one of the first things that you will then experience through the actual diet then in itself, as a result of maybe poor planning or just simply expecting or aiming for too much, which is having a very, very aggressive rate of loss. So if you're having an unnecessarily fast rate of loss, your diet is going to feel rough as hell. That is one of the number one reasons, in my opinion, why during a prep or during a diet, people struggle so much, people find it so hard, is because their rate of loss is so high, like really, really, really high. And yes, like I've mentioned there, sometimes in the earlier stages of a diet, the rate of loss might be a bit faster. You know, you might have it towards 1.5% rate of loss, which for most people, 1.5% rate of loss, you're looking at 2 to 2.5 pounds off a week at most, right? If you are running a diet where you are seeing like 3-4 pounds a week, or like, let's put it like 2 kilos, like Jesus, you're going to feel not very well at all. Like even in off season, if you're just running a diet phase, because when your rate of loss is that excessive and you are not using anabolics, like this is the thing, is you might see assisted athletes pushing a slightly more aggressive rate of loss. Could they still make it better for themselves by slowing that down? Probably, but they can afford to do it because they've got, you know, tools available to protect the muscle mass. They're probably still going to feel a bit rough, but it's doable. And there's obviously a lot of reasons why they might do that in order to limit time spent on cycle, etc. But as a natural athlete, like you're not going to want to teeter in that territory, especially as you get leaner. You know, when you're leaner, you do not want to be there. Like 1% and below is a beautiful place to be as you start to get within 15 pounds, you know, 15 to 20 pounds even, striking distance of stage, depending on the individual. Because when the rate of loss is really fast, you're basically obviously just doing a lot to see that rate of loss. So the deficit's going to be pretty catastrophic. You know, you're going to be eating very little and you're going to be doing a lot. And you're now going to be risking a huge amount of muscle mass loss, because the rate of loss is so much that the proportion of that, the weight that's coming off, that's going to be muscle relative to fat is now higher. So you're at greater risk of losing muscle now because the rate of loss is so high. And also that's kind of also contributed to the fact that when you are pushing so hard, you're eating so little, you're underfueling performance, you're doing so much, so your body is battered, you're going to see a huge reduction in training performance. So these are all things that are not going to help. And then you're going to have seriously accumulated fatigue. So this diet feels awful. And then you might even not feel good when you even look at yourself because you're like, shit, I look flat and I actually look like I'm losing muscle here and I'm not feeling great. And you really shouldn't feel like that, to be honest. Now, you sometimes get to points in prep where what's going to be done is going to be done, especially in a first prep situation if you don't know what your stage weight's going to be. But especially for like an off-season diet, don't be pushing crazy rates of loss. Like you do hear people say all the time, like keep it efficient. But like £2 a week is efficient, like especially for most females. For males who are like 200 pounds, they might come down 4 pounds a week, and that's fine because that's a bit closer to their 1.5 to maybe 2% rate of loss. But for a female who probably weighs on average anywhere from 120 to 165 to 170 pounds, like that's just too much. It's too much, and you're going to feel like shit. And then you will also have a higher risk of the adverse, like even physiological effects, where maybe even in those diets you're like seeing a loss of cycle, you're seeing chronic fatigue, and you're now in a position coming out the back end of that diet where like your training is so bad and you feel so bad that it's like, what have you gained? What have you gained from that? Like my honest question when I sometimes see that is like, why? Like why do that? Because it's not necessary. So manage your rate of loss. If your rate of loss is too fast, slow it down. Because you don't need to be picking up a rate of loss so excessive, especially when you are of like still good body fat levels. You're not like, let's be honest, you're not like obese, which is where ultimately you're not going to see huge adverse effects through seeing a slightly faster rate of loss. So be mindful with that one. Next point that we're going to come on to is going to be around training and managing your training to ensure that, again, like the diet doesn't feel so difficult as a result of the fact that training performance is suffering considerably, and you are also then outside of the gym potentially experiencing a huge amount of training fatigue. So above anything else, obviously the very important thing to point out is do not neglect devolumes or deloads during a diet or during a prep. Sometimes it can be quite easy to almost not be able to appreciate training fatigue, particularly in a prep setting, because you as an athlete maybe become adapted to the level of diet fatigue that you're carrying, and you don't know where to differentiate diet fatigue and training fatigue. For most individuals, you're going to need some form of deload probably every 8 to 10 weeks. This massively depends on the person. Depends on how hard you train, depends on how strong you are, honestly, with also the CNS fatigue you accumulate. And it also depends on your own recovery capacity. And this is something that you will experience through maybe running, off seasons or other diet phases with someone, and you'll just learn over time. But you can't ignore this. So be aware of like, okay, this is where I'm just feeling maybe a bit tired and I'm feeling a little bit weaker because, my body weight's down and I've been, on the stairs a few times this week. But then there's also a difference between shit, like I am mashed, I'm struggling to get through this session, I can feel my body is battered, I'm a lot more sore than usual, I'm struggling to get through movements, I'm seeing massive load and rep drop-offs. Like pay attention to that and run your regular deloads and devolumes, and maybe even plan them out in advance so that you don't get into a position where through that diet or through that prep you are just going, oh, well, I feel good, so I don't think I need it. Like plan it out and kind of force yourself to take it if you need to, because otherwise you will feel the effects of that. And whilst you might feel good in that 1 week, next week you aren't going to feel so good, and the next week after that you're going to be in a hole. So it's just having the awareness and keeping yourself accountable with those. But when it comes to the way that we actually approach training itself, when it comes to frequency and volume, remember that dieting in itself is a stressor. So this is now like a great analogy. You'll probably have heard a lot of people speak about this, is like you have a stress bucket. Yeah. So you can put so many stressors into that bucket before the bucket begins to overflow. So you currently might have an amount of stressors that are, existing on a day to day. So the water is filled to the top level of that bucket. And then any more than that, it would start to overflow. So that's where you're at. Maybe let's say that's where you're at before you start, this diet. And then you are keeping training the exact same. And then you are adding in the diet, which diet is a stressor. And now the bucket is overflowing and you've not made any of the compensations to manage your stress. And this is possibly where then appreciating, you've got to go like, right, training is a stressor. We need to bring down the stress that I'm experiencing from training and the fatigue that I'm accumulating from training at this point in time, along with, of course, managing your stresses outside of that. And that's why this is also important, as we discussed in the last episode, because that's going to be definitely a huge part of your ability to manage all the physical things, is having at least, your mental stresses and all those things kind of coming down. But this is definitely where your training frequency and your training volume will most likely need to be adjusted at some point. You're not going to be able to get through a whole diet, definitely not a whole prep, where your training volume and your training frequency stays the exact same. If anything, it's likely that you might be, say, running a higher frequency split when you're in your off-season phase. You're doing like 5 times a week and you're like, yeah, I feel good recovering from this. And then when you go into prep, you might need to bring that down to 4 times a week, or you might need to put yourself in a split where you do 2 on, 1 off. Like there's going to be situations where you then need to go, okay, we need to address then potentially frequency and then maybe the volume within those sessions as well. Possibly both, but definitely in a prep, when you get to the back end, your volume is going to be relatively low. Again, always depends on the individual and their intensity of training, but this is kind of assuming that you are training to a high intensity, you are training to failure, you are giving your best in the gym. You're probably not going to be keeping your training exactly where it is, and being honest with where your training performance is, looking at your logbook, looking at where things are at. It's why it's important, and it's why it's not, in my opinion, everyone has different training philosophies. It's not smart to just ignore your training, ignore your logbook and be like, oh, I'm dieting, I'm just gonna, throw this to the side, because maybe it's not a case of you now, what you might be doing is ignoring your logbook, going in and training at poor quality with your higher volume. Maybe it's a case of going, okay, my training performance is dipping. Let's actually keep aware of that. Let's just bring the volume down, or let's bring the frequency down, and let's keep the quality good. Let's make sure we're getting, good stimulus still, getting in good, strong work, which is important. And then, of course, you have movement selections as well. So you don't, I know that people love certain movements, but you might get to a point in a diet where you've got to swap out some of the things that you love to do if your body can't hack it anymore, because you don't need to do certain things that are going to be battering your body, and there's going to be some things that become very, very difficult. So things that require a lot of external stability, like from yourself, you've not got any stability around you. So if you compare a Smith squat and you compare a hack squat, you've got a huge amount of external stability. Smith squat, you haven't, and a huge amount of that stability is going to come from your own body. As you get leaner, you're going to struggle to do that. You might be going into these sessions and being like, holy shit, I'm beat up. I'm so beat up and I'm struggling to keep my performance. I'm trying to train my quads, but my lower back's taking a beating, my hips feel knackered. It's like, right, okay, you need to change that out so that you can do something that supports you more and has less of a beating on your whole body. You're going to create less systemic fatigue, and you're going to actually get better stimulus out of the movement to maintain muscle. So these are things you have to do. Same thing goes like swapping dumbbells out for doing a machine press. Just like all of these kind of things are very, very important to manage, because like training is a huge part of bodybuilding, and it's a huge part of why people hate dieting is because they feel like their training sucks. And yes, when you prep, when you get very lean, your training's not going to be amazing at the back end. That's just facts. But you shouldn't be really like hating training, especially in just a normal diet. You really, really shouldn't. Like, yes, your expectations and your outcomes from the sessions will shift because you're no longer going in and smashing PBs, but you shouldn't be like really hating your sessions. You really shouldn't. You should still be enjoying, going in, going through the movements. If you're not, changes need to be made. And again, training fatigue, all these things again add to your stress bucket. That overflow, that's probably also then why your body might feel very inflamed. You might not be seeing the adjustments that you need to be seeing on the scales, things like that. So that's decisions from like a training side of things. The decisions that you then also make from an expenditure and a nutrition standpoint are also very important, and these can really influence the degree of difficulty that you then experience throughout that diet. And a huge part of this is kind of relative to, again, the stress response that you experience through different changes. Like decisions that you always make with expenditure and nutrition. Because I know sometimes people say, what do we change? Do I change my steps? Do I change my cardio? Do I change my nutrition? And this is where you have to make changes relative to the individual, and changes have to be made to or yourself to make sure that this is having the least impact on the stresses created and the experience, like negative experience that you could be getting out of the diet. And that will be different for everyone. And some of the questions here that you might need to ask yourself, you might be asking the client, is like, okay, what is their training performance like? What does their time management look like across the day? For example, like if you're looking at steps versus cardio, do they have time to do more steps, or does it actually work more efficiently for them to do cardio? How much does that person weigh? How much are they going to get out of doing a few more steps? How many steps are we going to have to get up to in order for them to actually see more movement on the scales? Is it going to be more effective for them to do cardio? Does that work well given their cardio equipment availability? Does this work well given what their day-to-day looks like? Do they actually even have time to do the steps? Do they work an office job? There's so many different things that you have to consider. When you're looking at training, then it's going, okay, what's their training looking like at the moment? Can they even afford to do more cardio right now? Or are they really struggling with this? And is it impacting their performance? Can we add in different modalities of expenditure, like, for example, adding in a weighted vest for time efficiency? What can they overall manage better? Like, at the moment, are they even that hungry? Can we maybe make some nutritional adjustments? Is that going to be a lot easier than expenditure? And is that going to help them to actually keep their training in a good spot? Or are we in a point now where we can't be making any more adjustments to food because I actually feel as though this is going to be, really negatively impacting their performance because they've got virtually no fuel available? Are they struggling with adherence? Like, there are so many different things that you have to consider when you're making these adjustments. It's not just, okay, cool, let's, literally chuck everything at it, more cardio, more steps, less food. Sometimes with some people, like, that's needed and you need to make changes eventually. But when it comes to order of making changes, and when it comes to the recipe that works best for that person, you're going to find something along the way where those adjustments make sense. And it's why when you look at whatever anyone's maybe doing in their prep or in their diet, it's always different. Everyone's not doing 12,500 steps and 40 minutes on the stairs every day. Some people will be doing 15K steps and 40 minutes of CV on a rest. Some people will be doing 12K steps and they might be doing 30 minutes of cardio every day. Some people might be doing very moderate steps and they might have quite low food. It massively, massively depends. And you find ways across the diet to make these adjustments, and they might even change as time also goes along as well, based on what's going to work best for that person to be able to adhere well, to keep good training performance, and to ultimately like enjoy that diet without having a huge amount of stresses. So those are things that have to be considered when you make changes, and not just kind of making changes like willy-nilly as such. And also getting honest feedback on like how those changes are being implemented. If you are then also making expenditure adjustments, one thing to keep in mind is where you make these changes relative to the person's training. So I would generally always try to avoid doing cardio on lower days if possible. This is just something to note, because you will then notice probably more of an effect on training performance, trying to avoid doing cardio just before you do your session. I think I mentioned this in the last episode as well, but just keep that in mind as well. So actually then paying attention to like how these things are being implemented is important. And this actually comes in line with the next point, which is having accountability with the created setup of cardio and expenditure within the deficit. Because what you might sometimes find is that somebody's cardio amount or step quantity is increasing so much because of a decreased quality. So ultimately, as you go through a deficit, your body is going to want to protect its energy as much as possible. But what this might mean is that instead of, going on a walk and doing a good fast-paced walk, you're now dragging yourself. And now your steps have gone from 12,000 to 16,000, but you're not actually getting a huge amount more out of them. You're just having to do more to compensate for the poorer quality in work. So in order to prevent a lot of these variables from getting so extremely high when maybe they don't need to, find ways to keep them a bit more accountable. Because again, if you can keep the quality better, you're also going to find less of a time demand to have to do more things. So when you're doing your steps, keep them consistent. So try to either keep like a consistent step routine. So like say, for example, you go on like 3 30-minute walks across the day, and that racks up your 12K steps alongside any of the steps along the day. That's your routine. Or you at least have some form of tracking device that is consistently inaccurate, maybe, because all tracking devices are somewhat inaccurate. They're not perfect, but as long as you're using that consistently and you're keeping yourself really, really accountable with that, then that's brilliant. So be really, really mindful with those things. And when it comes to CV, have a setup that is, again, consistent. Probably the hardest one here is like when it comes to just like a standard bike. So sometimes when a lot of people are doing like cardio on a bike or maybe even on a cross trainer, they're starting to go slower and slower and slower. And that 30 minutes that used to burn 300 calories is now 30 minutes that burns 180, maybe especially if you're getting leaner. So having here a heart rate goal, a duration goal, and or one of the best things is like having a level. So like if you can select a speed on, like, this is why Stairmasters are often really great, that's going to be really helpful because you can always keep it the same. And then of course you can track your heart rate alongside those things to make sure that you're always keeping things within a given range, so that as you start to adapt to that mode of cardio, or as your body starts to get more tired, you can still keep yourself accountable with the targets that you have. Because otherwise, like I say, you're going to end up driving these things up and up and up and up and up, and then you're going to just feel more and more stressed, and that's going to make that phase a lot more difficult. Now, those are kind of honestly the main points that I wanted to cover when it comes to variables that you can manage to ensure that the phase doesn't actually become more difficult than it actually needs to be. But there's a couple of things that I want to touch on to end this episode that are maybe some reasons why a diet is quote unquote difficult, or maybe you're having to push for quite a big deficit, let's say, that are for reasons that you cannot change. The first one is that you might have a very adaptive metabolism. Some people do just very simply have adaptive metabolism. Often it's genetic. And this is basically where in an off-season, say, your food gets extremely high because your metabolism is extremely adaptive. So you're always adapting to the adjustments made. So you're having to, keep making changes in order for you to keep moving in surplus, which is why food is crazy, crazy high. But then it can also happen on the inverse, where as you start to come into a deficit, you're adapting to change, adapting to change, adapting to change. And sometimes that's where, if you say work with somebody who does have a very adaptive metabolism, actually like making changes quite frequently might be necessary, and making like small frequent changes can actually be more productive for fat loss for them. So that's a very like odd case. It doesn't always happen. Like some people will get food crazy high in off season, but then they will actually still be totally fine as they come down. But having an awareness that like, okay, if you are one of those individuals, learn how to manage it, learn how to make changes that work well, and kind of accept like, okay, this is the way it is, I've got to crack on. So that's one thing. Another thing, which is probably one of the most common things, is that you maybe are just a small individual. So maybe in stature, in structure, you're small, and you have very little muscle mass, because the less muscle that you have, the more difficult a diet's going to be. Because one, you're going to be eating so much less, doing so much more to create a deficit. And secondly, you're probably also not going to look great when you come down, which also doesn't make you feel so great. So that's why, spending a good amount of time to actually grow and be in a position where you're ready to diet and to prep, like you need to have muscle before you do these things, is essential. So don't forget that factor. But especially as a smaller person, you might quote unquote have to diet harder in order to get leaner and to just simply be in a deficit. If you weigh 100 pounds, 120, 130 pounds max, like you're not going to be able in most cases to eat a lot of food or do very little and still see fat loss come down. Now, generally for a lot of people, the rate of loss and the lean body mass that you have, how lean you are, is going to be playing a role in how you feel. So it's not always, oh, well, I'm eating this food and you're eating that food, so my diet's harder than you. No, because you're still going to feel the same in terms of like energy levels. You're still in a deficit. But the difference is that when you are very small, obviously, you're probably going to find that you maybe feel a little bit more knackered if you are having to do more cardio, especially because when you weigh very little, doing 16k steps a day, or just doing 20 minutes on the bike isn't going to be enough. You might have to do 40 minutes on the stairs. Like these are just things that are going to have to happen if you are in that situation. And most people that I've ever spoken to that have been in like a similar boat to myself, being 5 foot or below, like we spoke to Claire on a recent episode and she was saying it herself, like she's 95 pounds on stage, she's got to push hard. Nicola from A1 Tanning said the exact same thing to me. It's not uncommon for her to be down 800, 900 calories, like very, very low, to kind of get things moving in those final stages and to keep them moving, because that's the way that it is. But that will most likely be the situation that you are in the very final stages of a prep. But even for myself, like totally transparent with you guys, like I'm in a normal diet phase. On a rest day, I am eating 140 grams of carbs. Training days at the moment, I think like 160. Like I don't eat a huge amount because I'm not very big. Bottom line. Thankfully my expenditure is not crazy high, but like that's not abnormal for me. It's not abnormal, and I'm used to it. And like I said as well, like I get, especially in a diet like this, because I'm not super lean, like I don't feel bad from doing that. It's just what you expect. Like that, I'm not going to be eating 300 grams of carbs and losing weight. I'm just not. I don't have a naturally very, very fast metabolism. Like some people will be able to diet on more than others, but for most people with a normal metabolism and maybe being like a smaller person, you're going to have to do those things. Like it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be actually hard, because like I spoke about last week, you can manage these things to make them easier. But it might mean that looking from the outside in, someone might say like, oh my God, that's so difficult. That's so much, like, it's just, it is what it is. Like there's not much that you can do to change that. And actually having awareness and understanding and going like, okay, like this is the way that it's kind of going to be. I just need to crack on and do what I need to do. Like that's what you need to do in that situation. So hopefully it has been helpful to kind of go through a lot of those things today. So if you are somebody who is finding your own diet difficult, or you have done in the past, or you're setting up a diet for somebody else, whatever it may be. Like, hopefully you can take something on board with these to hopefully plan that diet phase out to be a bit more productive. If you've done some of these things in the past, that's fine. You can learn from them, and you can put them into place for yourself moving forwards to help you to manage these phases maybe a little bit better. They're things that you can maybe look out for to help communicate with your coach to understand where the line draws between your own management versus maybe the prep in itself, and you can flag these things up. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful for you guys. Like I say, next week I'm actually going to do an episode on pre-prep diets, because I don't think I've actually touched on that before just yet. And this is probably, I suppose, like relatively applicable at this point in time, because the diet that I'm doing at the moment is like kind of related to my timeline. So yeah, it will be good fun to talk through that and actually use myself as almost like an example case study through that episode, which will be lots of fun. So I'm going to take you through sort of what pre-prep diets are, what they look like, how we manage them, why we use them, different ways of looking at them. So if you've got any questions on pre-preps or things that you want me to talk about or anything like that, let me know. You can put them in the sort of Q&A box that is below this episode on Spotify, or you can pop me a DM or a message on Instagram, whatever works best for you. But do definitely feedback to me. I always want to hear what you want to hear, because that's the most important thing. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have listened to the whole thing, it's amazing. I appreciate every single one of you who listens to me ramble on for almost an hour, but I hope I've kept you good company during whatever you are doing. Thank you so much for watching. Please share, like, subscribe, do all of that amazing stuff if you can do. It means the world. And I will catch up with you guys in another episode next week.